The precise click of the latch on the antique music box was a sound I lived for. A perfect, almost imperceptible snick that meant the mechanism, after weeks of painstaking work, now operated with the seamless grace of its original design. I leaned back from my workbench, the scent of linseed oil and aged wood a familiar comfort in my small, ordered studio. For 20 years, I'd found my peace in coaxing beauty back from decay, in understanding the silent language of objects worn by time. People often called me a restorer. I considered myself a translator. Each scratch, each faded veneer, told a story, and it was my job to honor it, to preserve its essence without erasing its history. My life, much like my workshop, was neat, predictable, and largely solitary. And I preferred it that way. Then the solicitor's letter arrived, thick cream paper announcing the unexpected inheritance, an isolated manor house, miles from anywhere, willed to me by a distant relative I barely remembered. A relative whose existence I'd frankly forgotten. The accompanying photographs, grainy and faded, showed a hulking shadow against a bruised sky, overgrown with ivy, its windows like vacant eyes. It looked less like an inheritance and more like a challenge or a burden. I packed light, just a few essentials, my most trusted tools, and a sketchpad. The drive felt endless, the asphalt narrowing into gravel, then finally a barely discernible track through encroaching forest. The trees grew taller here, older, their branches weaving a dense, light-starved canopy overhead. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the faint, earthy smell of decaying leaves and something else, something metallic, like old pennies, clinging to the mist that began to coil around the car's tires. When the tree line finally broke, the manor stood revealed. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a behemoth of blackened stone and crumbling brick that seemed to have grown organically from the very earth it squatted on. Turrets clawed at the slate-gray sky, and the roof sagged like a tired spine. Every window was either boarded up or shattered, reflecting nothing but the oppressive sky. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, guarded a long, winding drive choked with weeds. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a bird I couldn't identify. A prickle of unease, sharp and unwelcome, traced its way up my neck. This wasn't just neglect, it was an abandonment so absolute it felt deliberate. As if the house itself had simply been left to die. Stepping out, the gravel crunched under my boots, a loud intrusion in the stillness. I walked slowly towards the main entrance, my professional eye already cataloging the damage, dry rot in the lintels, cracked foundation stones, a desperate need for new pointing. This wasn't a restoration project, it was an archaeological dig. The massive oak door, swollen and warped, groaned on hinges that shrieked in protest as I pushed it open. A cloud of ancient dust billowed out, catching in the weak light filtering through the high, grimy fanlight. A grand staircase, its banister carved with grotesque, unfamiliar faces, swept upwards into impenetrable gloom. Patches of wallpaper peeled like desiccated skin, revealing older, faded layers beneath. I took a tentative step inside, my breath misting in the frigid air. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed to carry for miles, swallowed and then spat back out by the vastness. My hand, almost instinctively, went to the flashlight on my belt. Suddenly, the air shimmered, not visually, but as a sensation, a pressure against my skin. The musty smell of the manor vanished, replaced by a sharp, metallic tang, like blood and disinfectant. The towering hall dissolved, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I was somewhere else entirely. Fluorescent lights, flickering weakly, cast a sickly yellow glow over bare concrete walls. The air hummed with an unseen generator, a low thrumming that vibrated in my chest. Other voices, indistinct and muffled, echoed from unseen corridors. The space was cramped, claustrophobic, filled with the low murmur of unseen individuals. I was sitting, or perhaps standing, but my body felt heavy, detached. There was a sense of waiting, of being held. A deep, pervasive anxiety that didn't feel like my own. My throat was dry, my tongue thick. I couldn't move. I was in an intake holding area during power outage. Then, just as abruptly, it was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. My hand was still on the flashlight. My feet were still firmly on the manor's dusty floorboards. What in God's name was that? A hallucination? Fatigue from the long drive? My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but none came. The image of those flickering lights, that metallic smell, the terrifying sense of being trapped, it had been so vivid, so real. I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white. This house. It was more than just neglected. It felt like it was watching me. This was no ordinary restoration. This was something else entirely. And I was standing right in its maw. That comfort, however, was fleeting. The manor loomed outside my small, temporary workshop, a vast, silent sentinel of decay. The music box was a small victory, the house was a war. I had inherited a monumental task, but my determination was a stubborn, unyielding thing. I thrive on the challenge of bringing forgotten beauty back to life. It was a practical choice. He was located near the rear entrance. It was less grand than the main halls but offered a contained space for me to begin clearing out the detritus of decades. The previous owners had simply abandoned everything, leaving a chaotic jumble of broken furniture, mildewed textiles, and forgotten boxes. The air hung thick with the smell of damp earth and something indefinable, something ancient and still. I began by laying out my tools with my usual meticulous care. Canvas drop cloths spread across the grimy floorboards, protecting what little remained intact. My hammers, chisels, pry bars, and brushes arranged in a neat, accessible arc. I started with a section of collapsed shelving, carefully disassembling the rotten wood, separating salvageable pieces from those destined for the burn pile. The work was physical, satisfying in its directness. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows, making the air shimmer. After an hour or so, I reached for my favorite wood chisel, a slender, balanced piece of steel that felt like an extension of my own hand. It wasn't where I'd left it. I paused, my brow furrowed. I was certain I'd placed it right beside the claw hammer, nested in the canvas. I scanned the immediate area. Nothing. I sighed, attributing it to a momentary lapse, a distraction. My mind must be playing tricks on me, already affected by the sheer scale of the work ahead. I found it eventually, tucked beneath a stack of old newspapers a few feet away, an odd place for it to have rolled. I picked it up, a faint prickle of unease brushing against my resolve. I resumed my task, the rhythmic thud of wood against wood filling the silence. The manor, despite its vastness, was unnervingly quiet. No traffic sounds, no distant voices, just the creaks and groans of a house settling into its long decline. Or so I told myself. I froze, my hand still midair, holding a splintered shelf support. Hello? My voice, unexpectedly loud in the stillness, sounded thin and reedy. No answer. Only the ringing silence. I waited, straining my ears. The sound didn't repeat. It must have been the house, I reasoned. The old timbers contracting, settling. It was an old house, after all. These things happen. But the hairs on my arms stood on end. I shook it off, forcing myself back to work, but the meticulous rhythm was broken. My focus fractured. I kept glancing towards the corner, half expecting to see something, anything. My determination warred with a rising tide of unease. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. The single bare bulb I'd strung up for better illumination above my work area sputtered, dimmed, and then died. The generator, which powered the few working outlets I had given up. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the heavy-duty lantern I kept nearby for just such an eventuality. My hands searched the canvas. It wasn't there. I remembered placing it, just minutes ago, right beside my toolbox. I patted frantically, my fingers brushing against empty canvas, then the rough wood of the floorboards. A soft thump came from directly behind me, almost a sigh of displaced air. I whirled around, the sudden movement sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. My eyes strained, but saw nothing. Yet, I felt something. I stood frozen, straining for any sound, any movement. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just a general unease anymore, it was a specific, predatory gaze. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible gleam caught my eye, low to the ground in the pitch-black corner where I'd heard the earlier scrape. It was my lantern. How could it have gotten there? I had been working on the other side of the room. It was impossible. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I crept towards it, my steps unnaturally loud on the dusty floorboards. As I reached the lantern, I noticed the paneling. It wasn't just warped, it was subtly different from the surrounding wall. The wood grain didn't quite match, and there was a faint seam, almost invisible in the gloom, running vertically. It felt wrong, an interruption in the otherwise consistent pattern of the wall. My fingers traced the seam, finding a faint give. My restorer's instincts, honed by years of uncovering hidden compartments and false bottoms in antique furniture, kicked in. I pressed harder, feeling a slight shift. With a grunt, I managed to pry the edge with my bare hands, the wood groaning in protest. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and perfectly empty except for one thing. Resting on the dusty shelf within was a single object. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, no limbs, yet its form suggested something vaguely humanoid, almost embryonic. The wood was smooth in places, rough in others, and it radiated an unsettling stillness, an ancient, malevolent presence that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was heavier than it looked, dense and unyielding. The feeling of being watched intensified to an almost unbearable degree, no longer a vague presence but a focused, piercing gaze. I was not alone here. And whatever was with me, it had been waiting. The manor was quiet, the kind of deep, old quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than merely lack it. Outside, the wind picked up, a low moan through the ancient eaves, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the grimy window pane. I'd been so absorbed in the music box that I'd barely noticed the day fading into a bruised twilight. My stomach rumbled, a sharp reminder that I hadn't eaten since a hasty breakfast. Still, something nagged at me, a persistent itch I couldn't quite scratch. It wasn't about the music box, which was, if I did say so myself, a triumph. It was about the manor itself. Earlier, while tracing a hairline crack in the plaster of the library's north wall, my fingers had registered an odd discontinuity. The plaster, though uniformly aged, felt different, almost hollow in one specific section. It was a subtle thing, the kind of detail only a restorer, with years of feeling out the integrity of old structures, would ever notice. Most people would just see another expanse of crumbling wall. I saw a question mark. With a sigh, I pushed away from the bench. Food could wait. Curiosity, for me, was a more potent hunger. I grabbed a small, sharp chisel and a thin-bladed pry bar, then made my way back to the library. The gloom had deepened, making the tall, shadowed bookshelves seem even more imposing. I flicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path through the dust motes dancing in the air. The spot was just above a lower shelf, behind where a particularly heavy volume would have rested. I ran my hand over it again, pressing lightly. Yes. Definitely different. The plaster here was not adhering to solid brick or stone. It was a veneer. I carefully scraped away a small section, the old lime crumbling away like dry biscuit. Beneath it, I found not wood or masonry, but a thin, almost imperceptible seam in what appeared to be a larger, expertly disguised panel. My heart gave a little thump. This was the kind of secret I lived for. Hidden compartments, clever architectural tricks, they were like puzzles left by forgotten craftsmen. I worked slowly, meticulously, widening the scraped area, tracing the outline of the panel. It was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, perfectly integrated into the wall. No handle, no keyhole. I inserted the thin pry bar into the seam, wiggling it gently. There was resistance, but then a soft give. Something metallic and faintly bitter, like old blood, or perhaps just very old, stagnant air. With a final, careful push, the panel swung inward with a soft groan, revealing a narrow, pitch-black cavity. Taking a deep breath, I squeezed through the opening. The room was small, circular, and utterly bare save for a single, heavy wooden chest in its center. The air here was thick, heavy, pressing down on me. My light flickered across the stone walls, revealing no windows, no other doors. I approached the chest cautiously. No lock, no latch. Just a heavy, hinged lid. It felt ancient, radiating a strange stillness. With a grunt, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed linen, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was plain, the leather dry and cracked, with no title or inscription. Next to it lay a small, tarnished silver locket, engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize, a stylized knot of some kind, endlessly looping. I carefully picked up the journal. It felt heavier than it looked, its pages thick and fibrous. As I opened it, a cloud of fine, almost imperceptible dust puffed out, making me cough. The handwriting inside was spidery, faded ink on parchment-like paper. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a collection of fragmented observations, local anecdotes, and what looked like warnings. They speak of what is taken. Not coin, nor chattel, but the very threads of self. Faces forgotten, names lost to the tongue. A blight on the mind, they say, born of the old house. Another, much later, the villagers speak of the emptiness in the eyes of the family. A blankness. As if the light had gone out, leaving only echoes. They wander, lost in their own homes, unable to recall the path from hearth to bed. And the house. It grows. My brow furrowed. A blight on the mind? It spoke of a hunger, not for blood or flesh, but for something far more insidious. Memory. Identity. I turned another page, my fingers tracing the faded script. The constable asked after the missing child. I could not recall his face, though I knew him well. A boy, yes. But his features. A fog. Missing children, forgotten faces, a creeping blankness. This wasn't just disturbing, it felt personal. As if the words were reaching out, subtly, to touch something inside me. I looked up from the journal, my headlamp beam sweeping across the bare stone walls of the hidden room. For a split second, the rough-hewn stones seemed to shift, to morph. The damp, earthy smell was replaced by something acrid and metallic. The circular room stretched, elongated, and the stone walls became smooth, gray concrete, faintly lit by a flickering, emergency light bulb hanging precariously from a high ceiling. My hands, still clutching the journal, were no longer rough and stained with plaster dust, but clean, pale, and trembling. I was standing, not in a hidden room in an ancient manor, but in a vast, echoing space, fluorescent lights humming dimly above, a low, guttural murmur of voices somewhere in the distance. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision snapped back. The concrete walls were stone again, the sterile smell replaced by damp earth and decaying flowers. The flickering fluorescent gave way to the steady beam of my headlamp. My hands were back to being grimy, the journal's leather rough beneath my touch. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. What was that? A hallucination? I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, trying to clear the lingering image. It had been so vivid, so utterly real. But it made no sense. I was Reed, an antique restorer. I was in an ancient manor house, not some sterile, concrete facility. It's the stress. The isolation. All this talk of minds fraying, of things being forgotten. It's getting to you. I took another shaky breath, forcing myself to focus on the journal, on the tangible, undeniable reality in my hands. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The words on the page spoke of memory fading, of reality blurring. And for a terrifying instant, I had felt it, a profound disjunction, a sudden, alien memory that wasn't mine. This journal, this hidden room, and whatever malevolent history they held, had begun to touch me in a way I hadn't anticipated. The cold knot in my stomach tightened, a hard, indigestible lump. Missing children, forgotten faces, that creeping blankness, the journal's words weren't just disturbing, they felt personal. I couldn't stay in that suffocating passage, not with those words echoing in my head. I needed air, space, and answers that weren't scrawled by a tormented hand in a forgotten journal. The next morning, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a restless night of fragmented dreams, I drove into the nearest town, a small, sleepy place clinging to the coast. Its local history archive, tucked away in the back of the municipal building, smelled of old paper, dust, and something faintly metallic, like forgotten pennies. The archivist, a stooped woman with spectacles perched on her nose, gave me a wary glance when I mentioned the manor. Been empty for years. she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Always a strange place, that one." She directed me to a shelf groaning under the weight of bound newspapers and local records. Hours blurred. I pored over microfiche, squinting at grainy headlines, my fingers stained with dust. The manor's name, Blackwood Crest, appeared sporadically, usually in property transfer records or mentions of the founding family's social events. But then, the pattern shifted. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in the narrative. A local newspaper clipping from 1888 detailed the sudden disappearance of a stable boy, described as a quiet lad, known for his diligent work. No trace, no explanation. A few years later, a governess vanished, leaving behind only a neatly folded shawl and a half-written letter. The reports were always brief, almost dismissive, tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of livestock auctions. There were never any suspects, never any leads. Just gone. The official inquiries, if they existed, were never recorded beyond the initial report. More unsettling were the entries concerning the manor's occupants. Not disappearances, but a distinct kind of unraveling. Euphemistic, hinting at madness without ever explicitly stating it. They called it melancholia, a nervous affliction, or age-related decline, but the subtext was clear: the house took something from them. These weren't just random misfortunes. They echoed the journal, the blank faces, the encroaching emptiness. Back at the manor, a gnawing unease propelled me deeper into its forgotten corners. The house was not just old, it was hungry. One afternoon, while tracing a draft through the service wings, I found a heavy, unmarked door, obscured by years of grime and stacked lumber. Behind it lay a narrow, unlit corridor that ended in a small, windowless room. A utilitarian space, perhaps for deliveries, or new staff awaiting instruction, now utterly forgotten. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. My headlamp, thankfully, remained on, a fragile beacon in the sudden, total blackness. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a profound, suffocating pressure, like cotton stuffed into my ears. My own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Not a distinct word, but a breathy, sibilant sound, like dry leaves scuttling across a stone floor, or sand shifting in the desert wind. Nothing. I tried to recall what I had done just moments before the lights went out. Had I locked the heavy door behind me? I couldn't remember. The detail simply wasn't there, a blank space where a memory should have been. This wasn't just the house playing tricks, this was something more insidious. My scalp prickled. I started to back away from the iron ring, my foot catching on something unseen. I stumbled, my headlamp beam momentarily pointing at the floor, then up again. My breath hitched. My hands, clammy and trembling, reached for the doorframe, needing something solid. I pushed against it, desperate to escape the suffocating presence in that intake area. I felt a profound disorientation, a sense that the ground beneath my feet was dissolving. Was I truly seeing these things? Or was the house already beginning its work, eroding the edges of my mind, planting seeds of doubt that would bloom into madness? I had to get out. But what was it I was supposed to remember? I looked down at the faded script, the weight of the old journal pressing into my palms. Personal. It was a premonition of my future. The air in the manor suddenly felt thick, cloying. A shift in the atmosphere, not just temperature, but something heavier, more profound. My head began to throb, a dull ache behind my eyes that quickly sharpened into a piercing pain. The ornate plasterwork of the study's ceiling, usually a source of quiet admiration, seemed to ripple. The flickering gas lamp on the desk wavered, its light elongating and distorting the shadows into grotesque, dancing figures. A wave of nausea washed over me, so intense it buckled my knees. I staggered, clutching at the edge of the heavy oak desk, my knuckles white. The journal slipped from my grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud, its pages splaying open like a broken bird. The world spun, not just my vision, but a deeper, more fundamental disorientation. Then, the floor beneath my feet wasn't polished wood anymore. The gas lamp vanished, and instead, a single, bare bulb hung precariously from a frayed wire far above, casting a stark, sickly yellow glow. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the scene solidified around me. I was no longer in the study. It was a large, desolate space, partitioned by rusted chain-link fences into several cramped cells. The air was frigid, biting, carrying the stale odor of disinfectant, desperation, and something else, something metallic and faint, like the ghost of old fear. How? When? I distinctly remembered being in the study, the journal in my hands. I'd been reading about the manor's cursed past, about the disappearances. Now this. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged gasp. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. Details slipped away like water. Had I left the manor? Had someone taken me? The questions swirled, each one dissolving before I could grasp it. My determination to understand warred with a rising panic. Hello? My voice was a raw croak, swallowed by the vast, empty space. No answer. Just the endless, rhythmic drip. I forced myself to move, my legs stiff and uncooperative. My hands instinctively went to my pockets, searching for my tools, my phone, anything familiar. Empty. My fingers brushed against the rough fabric of my trousers, not the comfortable clothes I'd been wearing. These were thin, coarse, like some kind of uniform. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. My eyes strained against the gloom, trying to discern movement, a shape, anything. There was nothing. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but a sensation, a thought forming at the back of my mind, not mine. Forget. A jolt went through me. Forget what? It was right there, on the tip of my tongue, a familiar shape in my mind's eye. But the name. It was gone. I frowned, shaking my head, a desperate attempt to dislodge the block. Nothing. The scratching started again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible rustling. Fragile. Like a brittle shard of glass. A vague outline, a blur. My profession. Antique restorer. Yes. I clung to it, a lifeline in this swirling chaos. But even that felt distant, a story I'd been told about myself rather than a lived truth. It wasn't solid, not truly. It glided, not walked, towards me, the scratching sound intensifying, becoming a sickening scrape that grated on my nerves. It wasn't just trying to make me forget, it was trying to unmake me. This was the entity, I realized with a sickening lurch. This was its true nature. It didn't just drain memories, it consumed identity. The blankness in the journal, the forgotten faces, it wasn't just a side effect. It was the end goal. It turned people into echoes, into nothing. With each flicker, a piece of me seemed to tear away. My memory of my parents' faces, usually so clear, became indistinct, like old photographs bleached by the sun. My first restoration project, a cherished childhood memory, faded into a gray blur. The intricate carving on the manor's banister, the feel of the aged wood under my fingers, the satisfaction of bringing it back to life. I focused on it with every fiber of my being. The whisper intensified, a cacophony of lost voices, all echoing "forget, forget, forget." The scraping grew louder, closer, right in front of me now. My determination was a thin, fragile shield against an overwhelming tide. The name, Reed. Antique restorer. That too. A craft requiring precision, patience, a reverence for history. The thought was a burning ember in the ash heap of my crumbling memories. I pushed myself up from the dusty floorboards, the aches in my joints a familiar complaint. The manor stretched around me, a vast, echoing maw. Every shadow felt thick, watchful. I headed for the grand oak doors at the front, my steps determined. I twisted, pulled, then pushed with all my strength. Nothing. They were locked, bolted from the outside, or perhaps simply sealed by time and the house's own decaying will. I slammed my shoulder against them, a futile, pathetic thud that echoed back, mocking my weakness. Next, the windows. I remembered them, tall and arched, overlooking the overgrown gardens. I stumbled through the drawing room, the once opulent furnishings shrouded under dust sheets like forgotten ghosts. The windows here were not just locked, they were barred, thick iron rods set into the stone, rusted solid. I tried another, then another, in the dining room, the library. All the same. It was like the manor had grown a skin, an impenetrable shell designed to keep me in, or perhaps, keep something else out. Communication. My phone. I patted my pockets, fumbling through the lint and forgotten detritus. It wasn't there. I vaguely recalled leaving it on a side table in the study. I hurried back, my mind racing through the manor's labyrinthine corridors, each turn feeling less familiar than the last. The study door was ajar. Inside, the heavy mahogany desk was clear. No phone. No charging cable. No sign of it at all. I checked under papers, beneath the overturned inkwell, even behind the heavy velvet curtains. The landline. I vaguely remembered a phone in the kitchen, an old rotary model. The kitchen was a cavern of disuse. Cobwebs hung like tattered banners from the ceiling. The ancient stove was a rust-eaten hulk. And there, on a small, scarred wooden table, was the phone. Its plastic casing was cracked, the cord severed cleanly, as if snipped with heavy shears. This wasn't just decay. This was deliberate. The high ceilings of the manor kitchen began to press down, the ornate plasterwork blurring, dissolving into rough, unpainted concrete. The wooden table beneath the severed phone cord warped, became a gleaming, cold metal surface. My hands, reaching for the phone, found only cool, slick steel. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the vision held. I was no longer in the manor kitchen. The air was thick with the hum of unseen machinery, a low, guttural vibration that resonated in my chest. Bare concrete walls stretched upwards, featureless save for the occasional conduit pipe snaking across their surface. The floor was stained, a mottled gray, streaked with what looked like dried spills. How? How had I gotten here? The manor, the dust, the decaying grandeur, it was all gone, replaced by this stark, utilitarian prison. My mind scrambled, trying to bridge the gap, but there were only blank spaces, like pages ripped from a book. One moment, the kitchen. The next, this. I looked down at myself. My clothes were different. No pockets. No personal items. I tried the metal surface next to me. It was a bench, bolted to the floor. The door was heavy, solid steel, with a small, reinforced window at eye level. Beyond it, a corridor stretched into the gloom, lit intermittently by emergency lights that pulsed with a sickly orange glow. I pressed my face against the window, fogging the cold glass. The corridor was empty, silent, save for the incessant, low hum and a faint, rhythmic click. Click. Click, that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of a relay, or perhaps a turnstile, repeating in an endless, maddening loop. I tried the door handle. It was flush with the surface, no visible mechanism. I pushed, I kicked, I rattled the heavy metal. It was unyielding. Click. Click answered me. It was a sound that felt familiar, yet utterly alien. A sound that my mind wrestled with, trying to assign it meaning, a memory, anything. It was like trying to recall a dream that had vanished the moment I woke, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. The click. Click. Click continued, steady, monotonous. And then, faintly, through the humming air, I heard it. A voice, muffled, distorted, like it was coming through an old intercom system. It was saying something, a phrase, repeating it over and over, just like the clicking sound. I strained to hear, pressing my ear against the steel door. Processing. Entry. Designation. The words were garbled, indistinct, but the intonation was flat, automated. My name, spoken by a machine in this sterile, horrifying place I had no memory of entering. It wasn't a call for help. It was an acknowledgement of my containment. The click. Click. Click suddenly sounded like a counter, marking something, marking me. And I had absolutely no idea how it knew. Or why I was here. Or what, exactly, was being processed. It wasn't a question, nor a warning. It was a statement, an inventory item. And the click. Click. I didn't recognize this place. The low, guttural hum of the emergency generators had just kicked in, casting a sickly green glow from scattered wall panels, painting the metallic surfaces in an alien light. My hands, when I looked at them under the dim light, were trembling. Not just from fear, but from a deeper, unsettling tremor that felt like it originated in my bones. I stumbled towards a console embedded in the wall opposite my bench. A single line of text pulsed, subject identified, read. The word subject pricked at me. I wasn't a subject. I was. Read. I lived in a manor, or did I? The edges of that memory felt soft, frayed, like an old tapestry dissolving into threads. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, reached out to the screen. It wasn't a touch screen, it was an old-fashioned interface, a keyboard tucked beneath a sliding panel. Curiosity, that ancient, dangerous impulse, urged me forward. What was this place? Why was I here? What did that machine mean? I fumbled with the keys. The screen showed a log entry scrolling by, timestamped. My eyes struggled to focus in the poor light. Most of it was technical jargon, codes, and numerical sequences I couldn't decipher. But then, a series of entries began to stand out, plain text, stark and horrifying. Log entry, date unknown, estimated 1700s, subject exhibiting rapid cognitive degradation. Manor staff reporting incidents of phantom memories and borrowed identities. Initial assessment suggests exposure to anomalous energy signature emanating from property's sub-basement. The sub-basement. The manor. The collector. I scrolled down, my fingers flying over the dusty keys, desperate for answers, even as every fiber of my being screamed to stop. It is a parasitic, sentient construct, tethered to the property's foundational structure. Feeds on the unique experiential residue of human consciousness. Specifically, memory and identity. Memory. Identity. That was what had been slipping away. The faces I couldn't quite recall, the skills I fumbled, the very sense of who Reed was. It wasn't just me. It had happened before. The entity lies dormant, a patient predator. It awakens when a new, strong-willed inhabitant takes residence. It slowly, meticulously, siphons off their memories, their defining traits, their very essence. The host becomes an empty vessel, a shell, a repository of borrowed experiences, its own self utterly consumed. This process can take years, even decades, subtly twisting reality until the host becomes indistinguishable from the entity's previous victims. The words blurred. My vision swam. I remembered the flashes of other lives, other memories, that had plagued me in the manor. The faces in the portraits, their eyes following me. They weren't just paintings. They were echoes, or worse. The host's identity is not merely erased, it is absorbed, becoming part of the collector's vast, horrific archive. The entity grows stronger, expanding its influence, its hunger insatiable. The manor itself is a manifestation of its accumulated stolen selves. Each brick, each creaking floorboard, each dust motes holds a fragment of a forgotten life. I staggered back, bumping into the cold metal of the bench. My hands flew to my head, pressing against my temples as if to physically hold my thoughts in place. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. This was the truth. It didn't just take memories, it became them. And the manor, my beautiful, decaying project, was its monstrous heart. It was a monument to stolen lives, a mausoleum of devoured souls. The entity cannot be killed in a conventional sense, it is an energetic construct. It thrives on continuity of presence, a living mind to feed upon. The only known method of disruption involves a complete severance of its tether to the physical plane. This requires a singular, potent act of will. A voluntary, absolute erasure of self, not through consumption, but through conscious, deliberate sacrifice. Not through consumption. Sacrifice. It demanded everything. But not in the way I'd thought. Not by taking me piece by piece until nothing was left. It demanded a choice. A conscious surrender, a deliberate unmaking of Reed, not for its benefit, but to sever its connection, to finally starve the parasite that had festered in that house for centuries. My hands dropped. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. The constant tremor in my body wasn't just fear anymore. It was the frantic energy of a trapped animal, seeing a sliver of impossible escape. The cost was everything. My life, my identity, my very existence. But it would be my choice. Not its feast. Not its collection. A defiant act against an ancient horror. I was no longer a subject. I was a weapon and a sacrifice. The click. Click. The manor awaited. The chill of the floor seeped into my bones, a sterile cold that had nothing to do with ancient stone and everything to do with linoleum. I blinked, the effort feeling like scraping rust from an old hinge. Where was I? My head throbbed, a dull, persistent drumbeat behind my eyes. It was dark, a deep, oppressive blackness broken only by the faint, emergency glow strips along the floor, casting the room in an unsettling chartreuse light. They pulsed, a sickly, irregular rhythm that made my eyes ache. I could hear the distant, muffled sounds of what? Footsteps? Voices? They were indistinct, like sounds heard through a thick pane of glass. My name. Reed. That much was solid, a single anchor in a swirling fog. But beyond that, the details of me were frayed, like the edges of an antique textile left too long in the sun. Memories flickered, disjointed and confusing. The manor. The hunger. That was clear, terribly clear. Not my hunger, but its the entity. It demanded sacrifice. Not by taking me piece by piece, but by demanding a choice. And here I was, in this sterile purgatory, the choice still burning like a coal in my gut. My fingers traced the rough texture of the wall beside me, concrete block, cool and unyielding. I remembered being brought here, or thought I did. I hadn't fought. There was no fight left, not in that way. Only the struggle to hold on to the last vestiges of who I was, so I could make the choice. The entity didn't just consume memories and identity. It became them. It assimilated, twisting the remnants of its victims into its own grotesque form, living through their stolen lives. That was why it demanded a conscious surrender. It wanted a willing vessel, not just a broken one. And that was my desperate plan. The power outage was a gift. It stripped away the distractions, the fluorescent glare, the constant hum of machinery. It was in this emptiness that the clarity solidified. If it wanted to become me, to assimilate my essence, then I would give it nothing to assimilate. The plan was not to fight it, not to banish it, but to trap it. To turn its own predatory nature against itself. The trick was in the conscious part. To shed my memories, my personality, my very sense of self, not through the entity's slow erosion, but through a deliberate act of will. To become a blank slate, not a broken one. And within that blankness, I would construct a prison. I closed my eyes, the green light bleeding through my eyelids. I saw the manor, not as it was now, crumbling and haunted, but as it had been, in its prime, grand and solid. I saw the architectural drawings, the intricate details of its construction, the hidden passages, the sealed rooms. I saw the ironwork, the heavy oak doors, the thick stone walls. These weren't just memories, they were tools. The entity wanted to merge, to become one with its host. But what if the host was an elaborate, self-contained cage? What if the identity it sought to inhabit was designed to be a labyrinth, a series of dead ends, an endless, unnavigable space. My mind, my very essence, would become a maze. I would offer it myself, yes, but myself as a trap. It meant not just losing myself, but becoming the loss. Becoming the permanent, featureless container. What would be left of Reed then? Nothing. Just the walls of the prison, an echo of a man, forever holding something monstrous. My stomach churned, protesting the gruesome truth of my decision. This was a sacrifice far beyond anything I had imagined. Not just my life, but my being. My consciousness would be the lock, my memories the bars, my very spirit the unyielding stone, but the alternative? To let it continue, to let it consume others, to spread its ancient blight? Now, I understood. It meant becoming a perfect reflection of its craving, yet utterly devoid of what it truly sought. My heart didn't pound. This wasn't a choice for survival. It was a choice for annihilation, for a purpose. A tragic, heroic end. I would give it what it wanted, but the feast would be its tomb. I would become the desperate plan itself. Where was I? My eyelids felt heavy, gritty, like they'd been dusted with fine sand. A low, persistent hum vibrated through the floor, a mechanical thrum that felt alien after weeks of creaking timbers and whispering drafts. My vision slowly sharpened, or rather, the dimness clarified. I was lying on my back, stretched out on a narrow cot. Above me, a single emergency light, battery-powered no doubt, cast a sickly yellow glow that barely reached the corners of the room. This wasn't the manor. This wasn't even close. I ran a hand over the surface of the cot, a thin, uncomfortable mattress covered in a coarse, scratchy fabric. I swung my legs over the side, my bare feet landing on the cool, unforgiving linoleum. The hum was louder here, a constant, irritating drone that seemed to burrow into my skull. The words floated into my mind, not as a memory, but as a label, a fact I suddenly knew without knowing how I knew it. Why was I here? Then it started. Not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling. It was trying to get in, to root itself in that blank space. But this time, I was ready. Or, at least, I had a plan. A desperate, fragile plan born from the shattered fragments of knowledge I'd fought to retain. I had to focus. The entity fed on absence, on doubt, on the erosion of self. My plan was simple, brutal, to build a fortress of me. A sensation like static electricity crawling over my skin. I pushed harder. I am Reed. I restore what is broken, what is forgotten. I conjured the image of my hands, calloused and stained, meticulously cleaning a tarnished silver locket, the delicate filigree emerging from beneath centuries of grime. I felt the smooth, cool metal, the subtle weight of it in my palm. The scent of polish, faint and metallic, filled my nostrils. The image wavered, distorted. The locket became a shard of jagged glass, reflecting a twisted, unfamiliar face. My hands were gnarled, skeletal. You restore nothing, a voice slithered into my thoughts, not with sound, but with pure, sickening intent. You only destroy. You take the past and make it a lie. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. The yellow light seemed to pulsate, the hum intensifying. No. This was the attack. This was it trying to undermine the foundation. I closed my eyes again, forcing the image of the locket back, clearer this time. No, I said, my voice firmer, louder. I preserve. I honor. I bring back what was lost. I remembered the satisfaction of seeing a century-old tapestry regain its vibrant hues, the way the light caught the newly exposed threads. I remembered the smile of the elderly collector who received it, his eyes alight with genuine joy. The entity recoiled, a sudden, almost physical jolt. The pressure behind my eyes lessened for a fraction of a second. It was a weakness. My certainty was a weapon. My father, I pressed on, summoning the memory. He taught me patience. He taught me the value of careful work. I saw his kind, lined face, the gentle curve of his smile as he showed me how to use a delicate brush on a fragile ceramic. I heard his soft chuckle, the distinct scent of pipe tobacco and old books that always clung to him. He abandoned you, the entity hissed, its voice sharper, more desperate. He left you alone. Unwanted. The memory twisted. His smile became a sneer. His hand, once gentle, became a clawed grip, pushing me away. The scent of tobacco turned acrid, choking. That my father's love was a lie. No! I shouted, the word echoing in the small room. My eyes flew open again, staring at the gray wall as if it held the answer. He loved me. He taught me. He was there. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the distorted image away, replacing it with the warmth of his arm around my shoulder, the quiet pride in his eyes when I finished my first small repair. The memory was a shield, a bulwark against the invading lie. I focused on the specific, undeniable details. The tiny chip I'd fixed on the porcelain robin. The way he'd ruffled my hair. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my teeth, making my entire body convulse. It was pain. My affirmation was causing it pain. This was the reveal. It wasn't just feeding on forgotten memories, it was feeding on the erasure of them, the doubt that replaced them. It wanted me to unravel, to become a blank slate, a vessel for its own forgotten horrors. But if I held on to me, truly, viscerally, undeniably, then there was nothing for it to consume. I stood up from the cot, my legs wobbly but resolute. The emergency light flickered, the hum growing erratic, almost frantic. I could feel the entity's presence now, a swirling vortex of malice and hunger, all around me, pressing in. It was throwing everything it had at me. My first project, I stated, my voice ringing with a newfound strength. A broken wooden music box. I spent weeks carving a new dancer, sanding the edges, oiling the intricate gears. I felt the smooth, cool wood beneath my fingers, the faint scent of cherry wood. I heard the delicate, tinny melody it played, a simple lullaby. It was never finished, the entity screamed in my mind, a frantic, desperate thought. You never finished anything. You are incomplete. But I had. I saw the completed box, sitting on my bedside table, the tiny ballerina twirling perfectly. I heard the full, sweet tune. I remembered the satisfaction. I finished it, I declared, looking directly at the reinforced window, seeing only my own reflection, distorted by the poor light, but undoubtedly me. I am Reed. I am whole. I am here. Each affirmation was a blow, each memory a weapon. The entity roared, a silent, internal tempest, and the air crackled around me. The battle for Reed had begun. and I would not surrender. The cold was the first thing. Not a biting chill, but a deep, pervasive dampness that seemed to seep into my bones and settle in the marrow. My eyes fluttered open to a gloom thicker than any night in the manor. Where was I? The question was a distant echo, bouncing around a cavernous, empty space in my mind. I pushed myself up, groaning. Every muscle protested, stiff and sore, as if I'd been wrestling with something impossibly heavy. The room was small, sparse. Concrete walls, a single bolted-down cot, my cot, apparently, and a heavy, steel-plated door with a small, reinforced window. A stranger stared back at me. Then, a flicker. A memory, or a shard of one. The roar. The silent, internal tempest. The crackling air. The battle. My battle for Reed. A jolt went through me, not of fear, but of a terrible, profound emptiness. The entity. It was. Quiet. Gone? Or merely dormant, slumbering within the ruins of what it had left behind? Nothing. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from beyond the steel door, making me flinch. The yellow light flickered again, dipping almost to blackness before surging back with a strained hum. A power outage. A small slit in the steel door slid open with a rasp, and a pair of eyes peered through. They were wary, tired. "You awake?" Then, a voice rumbled, muffled by the door. "Good. Stay put." "Where? Where am I?" My voice was a croak, unfamiliar even to me. "You know where you are." "Just calm down," the voice replied, curt. The slit slammed shut. "I know where I am." But I didn't. Not really. My name. Reed. Yes. That was me. What did I do? I was an antique restorer. The manor. The decaying manor. That was it. I'd inherited it. Begun restoring it. Then, a shiver. It had been there. Feeding. On memory. On identity. My breath hitched. My hands, calloused from years of delicate work, began to tremble. These were my hands. I knew that. But what had they done? Restored, but what else? A blur. My childhood home? A vague sense of brick, but no specific details, no warmth, no distinct images. My favorite book? My first love? The name of my closest friend? It wasn't just a general amnesia. It was selective, surgical. The entity hadn't just tried to consume me, it had succeeded, partially. The victory, if it could even be called that, felt like the most devastating defeat. I had pushed it back, yes. I had affirmed my name, my presence. But at what cost? My mind was a ruined landscape, cratered with forgotten moments, fractured memories, vast, empty expanses where joy, love, and experience should have resided. A single tear traced a path through the grime on my cheek. I was Reed, yes, but a Reed stripped bare, a skeleton of the man I once was. This wasn't freedom. Gone. Irreversible. The scars weren't on my skin, they were woven into the very fabric of my being, tearing at the edges of my selfhood, leaving me adrift in a world where I knew my name but little else that made it truly mine. The metallic tang of fear, like old copper, was the only taste in my mouth. It lingered, even as the memory of the voice, curt and dismissive, began to fade. But the meaning of it, the why I was here, remained a fractured mosaic, pieces scattered and too sharp to fit together. My determination, even in this fog, was a stubborn ember. I would remember. I would understand. Slowly, agonizingly, fragments began to surface. The manor. The dust. The chill. The whispers that weren't whispers at all, but a direct current to the deepest parts of my mind. The way the wood grains seemed to shift, the patterns in the wallpaper subtly rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. Then came the questions. Not from the curt voice, but from a different one, softer, yet equally insistent. A woman, I thought, though her face remained stubbornly blurred in my mind's eye. She spoke of stress, of delusion, of a necessary removal from the trigger environment. The manor. Always the manor. She called it a breakdown, a psychological incident. I nodded, numbly, my tongue thick. What else could I do? My own memories felt like borrowed clothes, ill-fitting and scratchy. Eventually, the door truly opened. Not the slit, but the heavy, steel slab. A man in a plain uniform, a security officer perhaps, gestured for me to follow. He didn't speak, just led me through a maze of corridors that all looked identical, past other doors, past other muffled sounds. The air here was cool, dry, and carried the faint, antiseptic scent of industrial cleaner. They released me. Or rather, they sent me on my way with a small bag containing what they claimed were my belongings, and a stern recommendation to seek further assistance. They had found me, they said, wandering the grounds near the manor, disoriented and unwell. The property, they assured me, had been secured. My restoration work, they implied, had been a strain. My own car, surprisingly, was waiting for me in a small, gravel lot nearby. The keys were in the bag. It was an old model, familiar yet alien. I drove, not back towards the manor, but away. Far away. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be somewhere new, somewhere clean, somewhere empty of echoes. I found a small flat in a different city, miles from the oppressive shadow of the manor. It was a sterile, box-like space, utterly devoid of character. Perfect. I needed blankness. I needed to rebuild. My hands, once so skilled, felt clumsy, hesitant. I tried to find work, to resume my craft. The familiar scent of wood polish, of aged brass, of ancient leather, should have been comforting. Instead, it pricked at a deeper unease. My first commission was a simple one, an antique writing desk, its veneer chipped, its drawers sticky. I set up a temporary workshop in the flat's spare room, the scent of solvents and glue soon replacing the clinical air. I ran my fingers over the worn surface, tracing the faint ghost of a floral inlay. This was it. This was my return. My victory over the manor, over the entity that had tried to steal my mind. But as I worked, a subtle shift began. I found myself sanding with an almost aggressive fervor, stripping away layers not just of grime, but of history, of identity. I didn't want to preserve the desk's story, I wanted to erase it, to impose my own blank slate. I'd always prided myself on my meticulous research, on understanding the provenance of each piece. Now, the old documents, the faded photographs, they felt like intrusive noise. I wanted the object itself, divorced from its history, from the lives it had touched. And when I looked at the desk, stripped bare, gleaming with a new, uniform finish, I didn't see the careful restoration of a craftsman. A perfect, polished emptiness. And I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. One evening, I caught my reflection in the newly polished surface of a small silver locket I was working on. My eyes. They were mine, undeniably. But there was a depth to them, a peculiar stillness that hadn't been there before. My face was thinner, etched with lines I didn't recall earning. I picked up a small, ornate hand mirror I'd salvaged from a forgotten corner of my workshop, an object I hadn't touched since before the manor. It had a delicate silver frame, tarnished black with age. My specialty. I used a fine cloth, gently working at the grime, revealing the intricate patterns beneath. As the silver gleamed, I held it up. My reflection stared back. And for a moment, just a fleeting, horrifying moment, the eyes looking back at me weren't quite my own. They held a glint of something ancient, something that had witnessed centuries. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by my own familiar, if weary, gaze. I dismissed it. A trick of the light. Fatigue. But the unease coiled tighter. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand trembling slightly. I noticed a small, almost imperceptible tremor in my fingers. I set the glass down. As I did, my gaze fell upon my hands again. They were still my hands, scarred from years of work, calloused. But the skin, just beneath the surface, seemed to hum with a subtle, unnatural energy. And then I saw it. It was a pattern I knew. A pattern I had seen before. The subtle, shifting, organic geometry of the manor's oldest, deepest timbers. The very veins of the house itself. The entity hadn't just fed on my memories, it had imprinted itself. It hadn't just taken, it had given star. Not a sickness, but a transformation. I wasn't just reed anymore. I was a vessel, a living echo of the manor, carrying its essence, its hunger for erasure, its quiet, insidious power. The victory was a lie. The entity wasn't gone. It was just internal. And the terrifying part? And I, Reed, the restorer, was finally ready to begin my true work.